First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. And I believe that last time I was here, we talked about how Apple needed innovation really to defeat this market share and macro issue that they were having. And I think, I mean, in addition to downgrade to neutral, there was actually also a double downgrade to sell. And you can see why from this report, right? So Apple had a lot of struggles in China in the quarter, down 13% year over year. That's a pretty scary number for a market that really used to be their driver for growth. So everybody that was bullish on Apple a couple of years ago would talk about how China was a huge TAM. And then it shifted to services growth because now China is really in a declining fashion. So when you go through Apple's earnings call, I think that we were impressed with the quarter. There was a lot of fears around the quarter, and the iPhone is what led the beat in the quarter, even despite the China and macro weakness. So that's good. And the services growth was pretty much in line with consensus with gross margins at the high end of guidance. But looking forward, we were concerned with their macro outlook. And I think that when investors think about allocating capital across this big tech space, they look at results from Meta, like you mentioned, they look at results from Amazon that are showing the secular nature of these businesses to be able to power through really whatever the macro situation is. And then you look at Apple, which is just this huge company that's completely reliant on macro and losing market share in China because really the Chinese market has become impossible and all of these smartphones are very similar. And like we said before, Apple really needs innovation to drive market share gains there. So we can see why people would be underweight Apple relative to these other tech names. And, you know, the call didn't scare us, but the call didn't leave us wanting to buy the stock at this valuation and this level.
Josh Sargent, nice to see you again. Just the China market, in your point of view, what are the biggest challenges Apple face there? Is it the resurgence of Huawei? Is it the geopolitics? Is it just the macro in China? What are your biggest concerns in that market?
So it's a couple of things. You know, I think that if you rewind the clock back to maybe when you or I got my first iPhone, right? You were paying up for Apple, and for lack of a better word, why? Because it was cool, because it was different, right? And now, when we fast forward 10 years later, right, we're looking at a China market where all of these smartphones that are coming out there have nearly the same functionality. So you have the resurgence of Huawei, you have a whole bunch of localized competitors that are selling smartphones for super cheap. And meanwhile, if you're in China, you have to take your currency, convert to USD to get an expensive iPhone. And why, right? And now I just think that the Apple brand doesn't have that luster anymore. It doesn't have that reputation amongst Gen Z where it's just like, look, this is the cool thing, I have to have it. No, I mean, you can buy something else that's 50% cheaper. So I think that the smartphone kind of functionality, utility has become more or less commoditized these days. And I think that what you're seeing in China is an economically affected consumer who's weary about their own personal consumption, right? And thinking to themselves, I don't need to pay up for this phone when I can just get a cheaper version of it. And like you said, the resurgence of Huawei and local competitors, I mean, the quality is there. And I think that is just simply the problem, is competition. And I think that until Apple can innovate to the point where they can bring the reputation back that having the iPhone is a must-have, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah,